The Sentinel drilling platform floated silently in the Alpha 3 belt, millions of kilometers from Earth. Minimal life support systems hummed steadily beneath the rhythmic blinking of red warning lights. The acrid smell of leaking fuel lines permeated the air, mixing with the artificial atmosphere that tasted faintly of recycled chemicals and stale coffee. Dr. Mara Novak sat alone in the observation deck, her silhouette barely visible against the vast darkness of space that stretched beyond the reinforced glass. Her fingers tapped nervously against the cold metal of her synthetic nicotine inhaler, a habit she'd developed to manage her generalized anxiety disorder. The medical board had strongly advised against her assignment to deep space work, but Helios Corp needed cosmic psychologists, and she needed the isolation. Atmospheric composition stable. Oxygen levels at 97%. All systems nominal, announced the station's AI in its characteristically flat tone. Mara ignored it, preferring instead to flip through her old journal entries about fear, her research specialty. It was 2387, the night shift on a drilling station that harvested exotic particles from the belt's unique radiation field. Most crew members were in cryosleep during the station's artificial night, leaving Mara alone with her thoughts and the constant underlying alarm signals that nobody seemed interested in investigating. The recycled air carried a distinctive chemical tang that reminded Mara of hospital corridors, sterile and somehow threatening. Her eyes wandered to the partially obscured Helios Corp logo emblazoned on the wall. Its slogan, barely visible beneath years of grime, "Humans fear, we harvest." An odd corporate mantra, she'd always thought. But marketing was never the company's strong suit. Mara's meditation on corporate slogans was interrupted by a shrill beep from the observation deck sensor panel. She frowned, setting down her journal. Warning, anomalous fog-like entity detected outside observation port 7. The AI announced, its voice somehow more mechanical than usual. Initiating emergency protocols. Before Mara could respond, the station's main lights cut out abruptly, leaving only the pulsing red emergency illumination. The sudden transition sent shadows dancing across the walls in a way that made Mara's heart rate spike involuntarily. "For Christ's sake," she muttered, tapping the communication panel. "Not again. Override emergency protocol Alpha 6 Delta. Containment without executive notification." "Override rejected," replied the AI. "Unknown entity classification requires corporate headquarters notification as per regulation." "I know the damn regulations," Mara interrupted, her voice tense. "I wrote half of them." She leaned closer to the observation port, squinting into the darkness beyond. Something moved out there. Something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In the privacy of her thoughts, a question formed. Could fear save me this time? It was a peculiar thought for a woman who had spent her career studying fear as a psychological response. The irony wasn't lost on her. With deliberate calm, Mara reached into her pocket and withdrew a small canister, labeled fear gas, experimental tension neutralizer, Helios Corp R&D. Her fingers trembled slightly as she removed the safety cap. Against all protocol and, perhaps, common sense, she took a deep, deliberate breath of the gas, letting it fill her lungs. A sardonic smile spread across her face as the chemical compound raced through her system. "Let's see what you've got," she whispered to the darkness beyond the glass. The first entity materialized against the observation port like condensation on a cold window, except it moved with obvious purpose, forming intricate patterns that resembled mathematical equations. Mara watched, fascinated despite herself, as she recorded its movements on her tablet. "Movement pattern consistent with fourth-dimensional algorithmic thinking," she noted, her voice surprisingly steady. Subject appears to be attempting communication through visual mathematics. She activated a plasma torch from the emergency kit, directing its beam toward the fog-like being. The entity recoiled, then reformed in a more complex configuration. Mara nodded to herself. A defensive reaction, but not aggressive. Interesting. As she continued her impromptu research, the station's communication system crackled to life. "Novak! We've got situations in sectors 7 through 9. Crew members are—" The voice of Engineer Rashid cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Mara frowned, quickly accessing the station's security feed. The cameras showed corridors filled with the same misty entities, surrounding terrified crew members who seemed to freeze in place before simply disappearing. Not violently, not dramatically. They simply ceased to exist where they stood, leaving behind nothing but a faint shimmer in the air. "Station AI, locate all personnel," Mara commanded, fighting to keep her voice level. 27 crew members unaccounted for," replied the AI. "Life signs terminated or removed from station parameters." The first flutter of panic began to rise in Mara's chest, approximately 15 minutes after her experimental dose of fear gas. The compound was wearing off, her natural anxiety beginning to reassert itself. She took another careful inhalation from the canister, calculating dosage against her body weight. While waiting for the chemical to take effect, she bypassed the station's security protocols and accessed the restricted Helios Corp files. What she found sent ice through her veins despite the chemical calm. Project Harvest, development of fear-reactive gases for emotional mining. Subject entities, interdimensional consciousness forms, attracted to specific emotional responses. Objective, harness fear response energy for deep space propulsion and weapon systems. "They're harvesting fear," she whispered, the pieces falling into place. The drilling station wasn't mining physical materials. It was a front for emotional harvesting. The fog beings weren't attacking. They were being weaponized by Helios Corp to generate fear responses. "Dr. Novak, you are accessing restricted files," the AI intoned. "This violation will be reported to corporate security. Override security protocol, authorization Novak Theta 9. Mara responded automatically, too engrossed in the files to care about corporate reprimands. Override rejected. New security protocols in effect. Mara glanced up, surprised. The AI had never rejected her override codes before. Something was very wrong. A movement caught her eye. One of the mist entities had somehow passed through the reinforced glass of the observation port. It hovered near the ceiling, pulsating gently. As Mara watched, it began forming distinct shapes, almost like sign language? No, chemical symbols. It was communicating through molecular structures that briefly flashed visible before dissolving. "You're trying to tell me something," Mara realized aloud. She grabbed her tablet, quickly sketching the symbols before they disappeared. "Oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen. These are neurotransmitter precursors. You're talking about emotions." The entity pulsed brighter in what Mara interpreted as affirmation. The station shuddered suddenly, emergency sirens blaring to life. "Warning. Station integrity compromised. Multiple hull breaches detected," announced the AI. Mara cursed under her breath. She needed weapons, or at least tools. The emergency kit contained little of use against interdimensional fog beings, but she managed to repurpose an oxygen canister into a makeshift gas projector. Not quite a weapon, but perhaps a deterrent. She pulled up the station schematics, studying the air circulation system. If these entities were attracted to fear responses, perhaps they could be lured or repelled accordingly. Her eyes fixed on a particular section of the schematic, the Nexus chamber, a central hub where all air processing systems converged. "That's where they'd be concentrated," she murmured, formulating a plan. The corridors were eerily silent as Mara made her way toward the Nexus chamber. Occasionally, wisps of the fog entities would drift past her, but they seemed less interested in her than in the other crew members. Was it the fear gas keeping them at bay, or something else? She passed the mess hall, now abandoned. Trays of food left mid-meal when the crisis began. In the medical bay, she found equipment strewn, about as if someone had left in a hurry. She grabbed additional medical supplies, including a powerful sedative that might prove useful. As she approached the Nexus chamber, the concentration of mist entities increased dramatically. They swirled and merged, forming a thick, pulsating cloud that blocked the corridor. Mara hesitated, then held up her tablet displaying the chemical symbols she'd recorded earlier. "I understand what you're trying to say," she called out. "You're not the aggressors here. Helios Corp is using you." The mist parted slightly, creating a narrow pathway forward. Mara took it as encouragement and pressed on, reaching the sealed door of the Nexus chamber. The security panel glowed red, locked down during the emergency. "Station AI, open Nexus chamber. Emergency override Novak Epsilon 3. Access denied. Nexus chamber containment protocols active." Mara sighed, pulling out a small device from her pocket, a security bypass tool she'd borrowed from engineering months ago. "Never trust a corporation to let you save your own life," she muttered as she attached it to the panel. The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a sight that momentarily stole Mara's breath. The Nexus chamber was transformed, every surface covered in a writhing, pulsating mass of fog that seemed to be both solid and gaseous simultaneously. At the center hovered what could only be described as a collective entity, vastly larger than the individual wisps she'd encountered before. As Mara stepped into the chamber, the collective entity turned toward her, or at least seemed to orient itself in her direction. The atmosphere grew heavy, oppressive, as if gravity itself had intensified. Without warning, Mara's mind flooded with images. Her childhood home burning, her parents' screams, the car accident that had killed her fiancé, the diagnosis of her anxiety disorder. Every failure and fear she'd ever experienced played simultaneously in perfect, agonizing detail. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath as a full-blown panic attack gripped her, despite the fear gas still in her system. This was more than memory. This was amplified emotional feedback. Her worst fears enhanced and projected directly into her consciousness. "This is what they want." She managed to gasp between ragged breaths. "This is what they're harvesting." Understanding crystallized through her panic. Helios Corp wasn't just collecting fear energy. They were cultivating it, amplifying it, using these interdimensional beings as conduits. The station wasn't a drilling platform. It was a fear factory. With trembling hands, Mara pulled herself toward the central air processing unit. If she could reverse the station's atmospheric regulators, she could create a feedback loop, redirecting the harvested fear energy back into the Nexus, potentially overloading whatever system Helios Corp had established. Her fingers fumbled with the controls as the panic attack intensified. The collective entity pressed closer, the pressure in her mind becoming almost unbearable. Memories she'd suppressed for decades surfaced with perfect clarity. Every moment of terror, every doubt, every failure. "Not today," Mara growled through clenched teeth, forcing her shaking hands to complete the reconfiguration. "Fear isn't yours to take." With the last connection in place, she activated the emergency purge cycle. Immediately, the air circulation systems reversed, creating a powerful vortex centered on the Nexus chamber. The collective entity writhed, its form destabilizing as the harvested emotional energy was sucked back into its mass. The pressure in Mara's mind intensified to an excruciating degree as the feedback loop grew stronger. The entity expanded, pulsating wildly, its structure beginning to break down under the strain. Light erupted from within its mass, not the soft glow of before, but a harsh, searing brightness that forced Mara to shield her eyes. A high-pitched keening filled the air, rising in intensity until it seemed to vibrate through Mara's very bones. The collective entity's form began to collapse, folding in on itself like a dying star. The last thing Mara saw before consciousness left her was the entity imploding in a silent flash of light, sending a shockwave of energy through the chamber. When awareness returned, it came in fragments. The cool floor beneath her cheek, the distant wail of emergency sirens, the taste of blood in her mouth. Mara opened her eyes to find the Nexus chamber in ruins, equipment shattered and walls scorched. Of the fog entity, there was no sign. "Life support systems rebooting," announced the AI, its voice distorted and glitching. "Station pressure stabilizing." Mara tried to stand but found her legs unwilling to cooperate. She dragged herself toward the door, her body protesting every movement. In the corridor outside, she found two security officers, Yamamoto and Keller, unconscious but alive. "Medical? Need medical," she managed to rasp, her throat raw, as if she'd been screaming for hours. Perhaps she had been. The next hours passed in a blur of emergency procedures and medical treatments. Of the original 43 crew members, only 12 remained. The others had simply vanished. Harvested, Mara suspected. Their fear converted to energy, and their bodies. She couldn't bear to complete that thought. 3 days later, Mara sat in the station's communications center, watching as the Helios Corp rescue shuttle docked. The corporate response had been predictably swift once the danger was past. A combination of effusive gratitude for her heroic actions and thinly veiled threats about the confidentiality agreements she'd signed. "Helios Corp values your contribution to resolving this unfortunate incident," the executive on the video screen told her, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Our internal investigation will be thorough, I assure you." Mara nodded, keeping her expression neutral. She had already secured copies of the Project Harvest files and hidden them throughout the station's damaged database. Helios Corp would find them eventually, but not before she had time to make contingency plans. As she prepared to board the transport back to Earth, Mara found herself alone in the observation deck one last time. The station was being decommissioned, officially due to critical infrastructure damage. But she knew the real reason. The experiment had failed spectacularly, and Helios Corp would need to regroup before attempting another emotional harvesting operation. Her anxiety remained. Of course, chemical treatments could only do so much, but something had changed. The constant fear that had shadowed her for decades now felt less like an enemy and more like a tool. A warning system finely tuned through evolution to keep her alive. Alone in the transport pod, Mara allowed herself a small smile as the Sentinel receded into the distance. "They tried to use fear gas on me," she whispered to the emptiness of space. "But I inhaled it and said, 'Let me keep being afraid.'" In her secured luggage, hidden beneath layers of clothing, a data chip contained everything she needed to expose Helios Corp's operations. They wouldn't abandon Project Harvest. Corporations never willingly gave up potentially profitable ventures, no matter how morally reprehensible. But next time, humanity would be prepared. Mara leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes as the transport accelerated toward Earth. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose stronger than her fear. She would fight for humanity's emotional freedom, their right to feel fear on their own terms, not as resources to be harvested. The battle had just begun. 6 months after the Sentinel incident, Mara sat in a small apartment in New Shanghai, surrounded by holographic displays showing news reports from around the solar system. Her exposé on Project Harvest had caused initial outrage, quickly followed by corporate denial and then Most troublingly, public indifference. People had too many immediate concerns to worry about abstract threats from interdimensional beings. She sipped her synthetic coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. Resources on Earth were increasingly scarce, with most luxury items reserved for the ultra-wealthy. The apartment was paid for by a journalist who had believed her story, one of the few who had. Another disappearance reported on Ganymede mining colony, announced the newsfeed. Third this month. Authorities blame equipment malfunction. Mara leaned forward, studying the footage. The familiar wisps of fog could be seen in the background of the report, dismissed by the commentator as atmospheric anomalies common to the Jovian moons. She knew better. Her tablet chimed with an incoming message, encrypted, anonymous. But she recognized the signature algorithm. It was from Lieutenant Keller, one of the survivors from the Sentinel. They're starting again. New project name, Emotion Extraction Directive. Same game, different name. I'm stationed on Europa Research Station. They don't know I know. Need your help. Mara closed her eyes, feeling the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. She didn't suppress it this time, instead acknowledging it, letting it wash through her. Fear was information, valuable information. Booking transport to Europa. She instructed her personal AI. Priority clearance, medical consultant cover. As the AI confirmed her arrangements, Mara opened her journal, no longer filled with academic observations about fear, but strategic plans for combating Helios Corp's emotional harvesting program. She had spent months building a network of allies, scientists, engineers, military personnel, even a few corporate insiders who had been horrified by Project Harvest. The last page contained a manifesto of sorts, her philosophical position distilled to its essence. Emotions are not resources to be mined. They are the essence of humanity, to be experienced and honored, even the difficult ones, especially the difficult ones. She packed lightly, clothing, medication, weapons disguised as medical equipment. The journey to Europa would take weeks, even on the fastest available transport. Time enough to prepare, to plan, to steel herself for the confrontation to come. As she left the apartment, Mara caught her reflection in the window, thinner than she had been before the Sentinel, with new lines etched around her eyes. But there was a hardness there too, a determination that had been absent before. She had been forged in fear, tested by terror, and emerged stronger. They tried to use fear gas on me, she reminded herself, a mantra that had sustained her through the darkest moments of doubt. But I inhaled it and said, let me keep being afraid. The transport to Europa was crowded, uncomfortable, filled with contractors and specialists hired by various corporations to work the outer system. Mara kept to herself, reviewing the data Keller had sent, schematics of the Europa facility, personnel records, security protocols. Helios Corp had learned from the Sentinel disaster. This operation was more sophisticated, better protected. During the long journey, Mara occasionally glimpsed wisps of fog in the corners of the transport ship, quickly dismissed by other passengers as tricks of light or fatigue-induced hallucinations. She knew better. The entities were spreading, becoming more common throughout the solar system, whether drawn by human fear or deliberately deployed by Helios Corp. Their presence was a warning. 3 weeks into the journey, the ship's AI announced an unexpected course correction. Due to gravitational anomalies in the planned route, we will be diverting through the Cassini division. It informed the passengers. This will add approximately 36 hours to our journey time. Helios Corp apologizes for any inconvenience. Mara frowned. The Cassini division was notoriously empty. Few ships ventured there, and for good reason. The electromagnetic interference made communications unreliable, and the sparse traffic meant rescue would be unlikely in an emergency. Perfect place for an accident, she murmured. drawing curious glances from nearby passengers. She made her way to the ship's observation deck, ostensibly to view Saturn's rings as they passed through the division. In reality, she wanted to check for signs of the fog entities. Their presence would confirm her suspicions. The deck was nearly empty, most passengers preferring the artificial entertainment of the ship's recreation areas. Mara positioned herself near an emergency escape pod, casually inspecting its systems while appearing to admire the view. Sure enough, as the ship entered the division, wisps of fog began to appear outside the reinforced windows, thicker and more numerous than she had seen since the Sentinel. They moved with purpose, surrounding the ship in a gradually tightening formation. Mara quickly accessed the ship's communication system, sending an encrypted burst transmission to her network before the interference could block it completely. A distress signal of sorts, though not one the ship's AI would recognize as such. "Passenger alert, please return to your cabins immediately," the AI announced suddenly. "We are experiencing minor atmospheric fluctuations that require cabin pressurization." They're making their move, Mara thought, gripping the emergency release handle of the escape pod. The question was whether Helios Corp merely wanted to silence her, or if this entire ship was to be a harvesting ground. Either way, she had no intention of cooperating. As the other passengers hurriedly left the observation deck, Mara slipped into the escape pod, sealing the door behind her. The pod systems activated automatically, but she overrode the distress beacon, no point alerting Helios Corp to her escape. Through the pod's small viewport, she watched as the fog entities completely enveloped the transport ship. The vessel's lights flickered, then stabilized at a dim red glow, reminiscent of the Sentinel during the crisis. Emergency systems activating, or something else entirely? Mara didn't wait to find out. She launched the pod, the sudden acceleration pressing her back into the cushioned seat as the small vessel shot away from the transport. The navigation system protested, warning of the dangers of unplanned trajectories through the Cassini division. But she ignored it, manually plotting a course that would use Saturn's gravity to slingshot the pod toward Jupiter and, eventually, Europa. As the transport ship receded into the distance, Mara allowed herself a moment of regret for the passengers and crew she had left behind. But there had been no time to warn them, no way to save everyone. She had to focus on the larger mission, stopping Helios Corp's harvesting program before it could spread further. The pod's limited systems didn't include long-range communication capabilities, meaning she would be out of contact with her network until she reached Europa, assuming the pod's life support lasted that long. It had been designed for short-term survival, not interplanetary travel. Recalculating life support duration based on current occupancy and trajectory, she instructed the pod's basic AI, implement maximum conservation protocols. Life support sufficient for 27 days at minimum consumption levels. The AI responded. Current trajectory will reach Europa in 34 days. Mara closed her eyes, considering her options. 7 days without life support. Not survivable. Obviously. She needed to find an intermediate stop, somewhere to resupply or acquire a different vessel. The navigation database showed an automated refueling station orbiting Titan, used primarily by mining vessels. It wasn't ideal. Helios Corp would certainly check such locations once they realized she had escaped. But it was her only viable option. "Revise trajectory for Titan Refueling Station Alpha," she commanded. "Calculate minimum energy course." As the pod adjusted its course, Mara took inventory of her limited supplies. The emergency rations would last 2 weeks if strictly rationed. Water recycling was efficient enough to sustain her indefinitely. Medical supplies were basic, but adequate for her needs. Most importantly, she still had the data on Project Harvest and its successor, the Emotion Extraction Directive. As long as that information reached Europa and her contact there, Her mission could continue even if she didn't survive the journey. The pod's small cabin grew colder as the life support systems reduced power consumption to extend their duration. Mara wrapped herself in the emergency thermal blanket, trying to find a comfortable position in the cramped space. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, wisps of fog appeared at the viewport, not outside in the vacuum of space, but inside the pod itself. Mara's eyes snapped open, her hand automatically reaching for the makeshift weapon she had fashioned from medical equipment. The fog didn't advance, however. It hovered near the ceiling of the pod, forming the now familiar chemical symbols she had first observed on the Sentinel. "You followed me," she said quietly. "Why?" The symbols rearranged themselves, forming more complex patterns that Mara struggled to interpret. Something about resonance, about recognition. "You recognize me from the Sentinel," she guessed. "You're the same entity?" The fog pulsed once, affirmative, she had learned. "Are you working with Helios Corp?" A violent swirl, negative. "Are you working against them?" The fog remained still, neither confirming nor denying. Finally, it formed a new symbol, a complex molecule that Mara recognized from her research. The chemical structure of fear itself, the precise arrangement of neurons and neurotransmitters that created the sensation in human brains. "You're interested in fear," she said slowly. "Not harvesting it, but understanding it?" The fog pulsed again, affirmative. "And you think I can help you understand?" Another pulse. Mara considered the entity floating before her. If it had wanted to harm her, it could have done so already. Instead, it had followed her, possibly even helped her escape the transport ship. An ally? Perhaps? Or at least, not an enemy. "I'll help you understand fear," she decided. "If you help me reach Europa safely, deal." The fog entity swirled in what might have been agreement, then dispersed, becoming nearly invisible against the pod's metallic ceiling. Mara settled back, adjusting the thermal blanket. She wasn't alone anymore, though whether that was comforting or concerning remained to be seen. The journey to Titan passed in a blur of cold, hunger, and increasing anxiety. The fog entity remained with her, occasionally forming symbols that Mara gradually learned to interpret more accurately. It was curious about human emotions, particularly fear, which it seemed to perceive as energy rather than experience. "Fear evolved as a survival mechanism," Mara explained during one of their one-sided conversations. "It keeps us alive by making us avoid danger." The entity formed symbols, questioning why humans would then try to eliminate fear through medication and therapy. The very work Mara had dedicated her career to before the Sentinel incident. "Because fear can become maladaptive," she replied. "When it prevents us from living rather than helping us survive, it becomes a problem to solve rather than a tool to use." The entity seemed to contemplate this, forming a series of molecular structures that Mara eventually recognized as various psychiatric medications, including the anti-anxiety drugs she had taken for years. "Yes, that's what I used to take," she confirmed. "Not anymore, though. Now I prefer to feel my fear. It's honest." As the pod approached Titan, Mara prepared for what would likely be a confrontation. Helios Corp would have alerted all its facilities to watch for her, and the refueling station would be no exception. "I need you to help create a diversion," she told the fog entity. "Can you affect electronic systems?" The entity pulsed affirmatively. "Good. When we dock, I need you to disable the station's security protocols long enough for me to access a new vessel. Can you do that without harming anyone on the station?" Another affirmative pulse. The plan worked better than Mara had dared hope. As the escape pod docked with the refueling station, the fog entity slipped through the airlock seals and infiltrated the station systems. Alarms blared briefly, then fell silent as emergency bulkheads sealed seemingly at random throughout the facility. In the confusion, Mara accessed the docking registry and located a small survey vessel, scheduled for maintenance. It was faster than the escape pod, better equipped, and, most importantly, had enough fuel to reach Europa without additional stops. The station's skeleton crew was too busy dealing with the malfunctioning systems to notice one woman making her way to the maintenance bay. By the time the fog entity returned to her side, Mara had already prepped the survey vessel for departure. "Good work," she told it as they slipped away from the station. "Now let's hope Helios Corp doesn't realize we were ever there." The survey vessel was a significant upgrade. Proper life support, communication systems, even a small galley where Mara could prepare hot meals rather than the cold rations she'd endured in the escape pod. She took full advantage of the improved accommodations, recovering her strength for the challenges ahead. With the vessel's enhanced systems, she was able to re-establish contact with her network, receiving updated information about the situation on Europa. What she learned was troubling. Helios Corp had accelerated the emotion extraction directive, possibly in response to her escape. According to Keller, they were now harvesting not just fear, but a range of human emotions, with experiments focusing particularly on the intensity of despair. "They're refining the process," Mara murmured, studying the data Keller had sent. "Making it more efficient, more targeted." The fog entity formed questioning symbols near her shoulder. "They're learning from their mistakes," she explained. "The Sentinel was crude, harvesting raw fear response. Now they're extracting specific emotional energies for different applications." She pointed to a schematic in Keller's data. "See this? They're using despair for deep space propulsion, anger for weapon systems, and anxiety for shield technology." The entity's response was unexpected, a complex symbol structure that Mara hadn't seen before, something that resembled both a warning and a prediction. "What is it? What are you trying to tell me?" The symbols rearranged, showing molecular structures breaking down, chemical bonds fracturing. It took Mara several minutes to understand. "The emotions, they're not stable when harvested this way. They break down?" Affirmative pulse. "And when they break down, what happens?" The entity formed a simple but chilling response, an expanding sphere, followed by nothing at all, a void. "An explosion? No. Something worse. A reality fracture?" Affirmative pulse, more emphatic this time. Mara sat back, processing the implications. Helios Corp wasn't just playing with fire. They were potentially destabilizing reality itself. The danger was far greater than she had imagined. "We need to move faster," she decided, adjusting the vessel's course for maximum speed rather than efficiency. If they've already started large-scale harvesting, we might not have much time. The survey vessel pushed through the void between Saturn and Jupiter, its engines straining against the limitations of its design. Mara monitored the systems constantly, pushing them to their limits while the fog entity assisted by optimizing energy flow in ways that shouldn't have been possible according to standard physics. Europa grew from a distant point of light to a distinct moon, its icy surface reflecting the distant sun with a cold brilliance. Beneath that ice lay a vast ocean, and within that ocean, Helios Corp had established its research facility, conveniently hidden from oversight and observation. "We'll need to approach from the dark side," Mara told the entity. "Avoid their detection systems for as long as possible." The entity formed symbols suggesting an alternative, approaching directly, using its abilities to mask their presence from the facility's sensors. "You can do that? Affect their systems from this distance?" Affirmative pulse, though with a qualification. It would be temporary enough to get them close, but not to maintain the deception indefinitely. "It's risky," Mara mused, "but it might be our best option. If we can dock directly rather than trying to traverse the surface, we'll have a better chance of reaching Keller quickly." The decision made, they approached Europa on a direct course toward the facility, As they entered detection range, the fog entity expanded, filling the vessel's cabin with a fine mist that somehow extended beyond the hull, enveloping the entire ship in a shroud that bent light and sensor readings around them. The facility's automated docking systems registered their approach, but categorized the vessel as an authorized supply ship, assigning them a docking port without challenge. Mara held her breath as they made final approach, half expecting alarms to sound at any moment. None came. The docking clamps engaged with a solid thunk, and the airlock cycled normally. So far, so good. "Stay close," Mara whispered to the entity as they prepared to enter the facility. "If we're separated, meet at the central processing hub. That's where they'll be controlling the harvesting operations." The entity condensed itself into a barely visible wisp that followed Mara like a shadow as she moved through the airlock. The corridor beyond was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of a research facility notably absent. Mara checked her handheld scanner, confirming what her instincts already told her. The life sign readings were far below what would be expected for a facility this size. Either most of the personnel had been evacuated, or... A flash of movement caught her eye. A researcher in a Helios Corp uniform hurrying down an intersecting corridor. His movements were strange, almost mechanical, and his eyes... Mara suppressed a gasp. His eyes were clouded with the same mist that composed her companion entity. "They're being controlled," she whispered. "Or possessed?" The fog entity formed a corrective symbol, not possession, but resonance. The harvested emotions were creating feedback loops in the researchers' minds, making them extensions of the harvesting system rather than independent operators. "Can you break the connection?" Negative swirl, not without harm to the affected humans. Mara nodded grimly. "Then we focus on shutting down the system. Once the harvesting stops, will they return to normal?" Affirmative pulse, though with qualification. The longer the resonance continued, the more difficult recovery would be. Using Keller's schematics, Mara navigated the labyrinthine facility, avoiding the shambling researchers whenever possible. The few times confrontation was unavoidable. The fog entity created diversions, flickering lights, equipment malfunctions that drew attention away from Mara. Finally, they reached the central processing hub, a vast chamber dominated by a glowing crystalline structure suspended in a field of shifting energy. Around the structure, dozens of researchers worked at control stations, their movements synchronized in a disturbing harmony. And there, at the primary control panel, was Lieutenant Keller. His eyes clouded like the others, his hands moving across the controls with inhuman precision. "We're too late," Mara whispered. "They got to him." The fog entity expanded slightly, forming an urgent symbol. Time. Running out. The crystalline structure was pulsating faster, its glow intensifying by the second. "It's going critical," Mara realized. "Just like you warned. Reality fracture imminent." She assessed her options quickly. Direct confrontation was impossible. She was outnumbered, and the researchers, while not fully conscious, would certainly defend the system. Sabotage from a distance seemed the only viable approach. "Can you disrupt the containment field?" she asked the entity. "Just enough to cause a controlled release rather than a catastrophic failure?" The entity's response was complex, possible but dangerous. The emotional energy had to go somewhere. It couldn't simply be dispersed without consequences. "What if—" Mara hesitated, the idea forming even as she spoke. "What if you absorbed it? Your kind is attracted to these emotions naturally. Could you channel the energy safely?" The entity swirled uncertainly. The amount of energy was far greater than any single entity could contain, but perhaps with help. As if in response to the unspoken thought, more wisps of fog began to appear throughout the chamber. Dozens. Then hundreds of entities, all similar to Mara's companion but distinct in subtle ways. They had been drawn to the harvesting operation, perhaps intending to stop it themselves. "Ask them," Mara urged. "Ask if they'll help." The communication between entities was invisible to Mara, but the result was clear. The newcomers swirled in patterns of agreement, positioning themselves around the crystalline structure in a complex formation. "I'll create a distraction," Mara decided, pulling out her makeshift weapon. "Give you time to coordinate." She didn't wait for a response, instead firing a concentrated energy pulse at one of the secondary control panels. The panel exploded in a shower of sparks, immediately drawing the attention of the enthralled researchers. As they moved to investigate, Mara's companion entity led the others in a synchronized approach to the containment field. They passed through the energy barrier, as if it didn't exist, surrounding the crystalline structure in a swirling vortex of fog. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The structure's glow intensified to a blinding brilliance, then began to pulse erratically. Alarms blared throughout the facility as the containment field fluctuated wildly. "Warning, emotional matrix destabilizing," announced the facility's AI. "Catastrophic release imminent. Evacuation recommended." The enthralled researchers paused in their tasks, confusion briefly overriding their programming as the harvesting system they were connected to began to fail. Some collapsed where they stood, while others began moving haphazardly, as if their motor control was compromised. Mara spotted Keller among them, slumped over his control panel but still conscious. She rushed to his side, dodging the disoriented researchers. "Keller, can you hear me?" He looked up, his eyes clearing slightly. "Novak, is that... What's happening?" "No time to explain. We need to move, now." She pulled him to his feet, supporting his weight as they staggered toward the exit. Behind them, the crystalline structure was now completely engulfed in a swirling mass of fog entities, its light pulsing in a complex rhythm that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of reality. The chamber began to warp visibly, space itself distorting around the crystal. Researchers still caught in the effect were stretched and compressed in impossible ways, their screams taking on an otherworldly quality that sent shivers down Mara's spine. "They're creating a controlled collapse," she realized as they reached the corridor, containing the fracture within the chamber itself. "Who is?" Keller managed to ask, his voice still slurred. "The entities. The fog being, they're not our enemies, they never were." They had barely made it halfway to the docking bay when the facility shuddered violently. A wave of energy raced through the corridors, passing through solid matter as if it wasn't there. As it washed over Mara and Keller, she felt a moment of absolute emotional clarity. Every fear, every joy, every sorrow she had ever experienced perfectly balanced in a single instant of profound understanding. Then it was gone, leaving behind a strange emptiness and the distant wail of emergency sirens. Did they stop it?" Keller asked, more lucid now. "I think so," Mara replied, helping him toward the docking bay once more. "But we should still get out of here before Helios Corp sends reinforcements." The survey vessel was where she had left it, apparently undamaged by the energy wave. As they prepared for emergency departure, Mara searched for any sign of her fog entity companion, but there was no trace of it, or any of the others. "They sacrificed themselves," she murmured, an unexpected sense of loss tightening her chest. "What are you talking about?" Keller asked, strapping himself into the co-pilot seat. "What were those things?" "I'll explain later," Mara promised, initiating the launch sequence. "Right now, we need to focus on getting clear." As the vessel disengaged from the facility and accelerated away from Europa, Mara allowed herself a moment to reflect on what had happened. The entities had contained the reality fracture, absorbing the harvested emotional energy at what appeared to be the cost of their own existence. They had sacrificed themselves to save a species that had been hunting and exploiting them. The irony wasn't lost on her. Beings that fed on fear had ultimately acted with more courage than the humans who had feared them. "Where are we going?" Keller asked, as Europa receded behind them. "Mars colony," Mara decided. "I have contacts there who can help us disappear before Helios Corp realizes what happened." "And then?" Mara considered the question. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but Helios Corp would undoubtedly try again. The potential profits from emotional harvesting were too great for them to simply abandon the concept. "Then we keep fighting," she said simply. "We build a network, gather evidence, expose their operations whenever and wherever they appear." "That's a big mission," Keller observed, his voice steadier now as the effects of the resonance continued to fade. "It is," Mara agreed. "But someone has to do it." She glanced at the empty space beside her where the fog entity had often hovered. "We owe it to them." As the vessel accelerated toward Mars, a faint wisp of fog materialized briefly near the control panel, forming a single, simple symbol before dissipating once more. Gratitude. Mara smiled, feeling the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a companion to be acknowledged. Fear had saved her, had driven her, had connected her to beings from beyond human understanding. "They tried to use fear gas on me," she whispered to the stars, stretching out before them. "But I inhaled it and said, 'Let me keep being afraid.'" And somewhere, in the vast darkness of space, countless invisible entities pulsed in response. The resonance of fear transformed into something greater: understanding.